This video will show you how to set up the lab report for the tile lab. First, underneath the title, you need to have a purpose or objective. The purpose should be a little more detailed than just the general purpose of finding the mass of a full tile. You should include something about either how you're going to do it or why. In this case, on my lab report, I mentioned that I was going to use measurements of small pieces of tile to determine the mass of the full tile. After the objective, you need a diagram of your lab. As we get further along in the semester, we'll have more complicated labs that'll involve ramps and pulleys and various other things, and you'll have a more detailed diagram of the setup. Right now, there really isn't any setup, just tile pieces, a ruler, and an electronic balance. So I just drew pictures of those in order to get into practice for always including a diagram in the lab. Underneath the diagram, you'll start your procedure. The procedure of the lab needs to be detailed enough that another person could follow your steps and completely recreate your lab. I should be able to cut this out and hand it to another person, and they should be able to come up with essentially the same thing that you did by doing the same steps that you list. Normally the procedure is done before the lab so that you know what sorts of data you're going to collect and how you're going to collect the data. If you've started doing this afterwards, you can fill in any steps that you miss. You'll notice that I am fairly detailed in the procedure that I listed in my lab. I started by mentioning how I'm going to trace the outlines of the tile pieces on graph paper, the size of the graph paper, and how I'm going to use those squares, count those squares and use them to determine the area of the tile in centimeters squared. For the regular rectangular or triangular pieces, I'm going to just use the area formula, like 1/2 base times height for triangles and length times width for rectangular pieces. The procedure should go on and include where you're going to record your data, for instance in a data table, and should also include what you're going to do with that data afterwards. So in my lab procedure, I also include mentioning that I'm going to graph my data and get the slope of the line, which is used to determine mass versus area. So all of those steps are included in the procedure, right up to why I'm getting that slope. I'm going to use that to calculate the mass of the full tile. So it's a very detailed procedure. This is an example of a graph that I did, and I've got my 4 data points graphed. You can see the red dots, 1, 2, 3, and 4, and a best fit line. The best fit line is not a connect the dots line. It's a line that goes from the origin, and we can start at the origin in this case because a tile that has 0 area obviously has 0 mass, so it goes down to the origin. And the line is a line that has essentially the same number of points above it as below it. It's called best fit because it's the best line I can draw through the points without doing a connect the dots sort of line. That would be inappropriate for this because we need to get a slope of the whole line. In the upper left-hand corner, I show the equation for the slope, and then I also show how I get the area of a full tile. And then I use the slope in a calculation to determine the mass of the full tile. Now you don't have to do this on the graph. You can do this in the data analysis section, or you can do this here, or you can do it in both places. I elected to do most of my calculations here, and I repeated the final calculation in my data analysis section to emphasize that that's really the whole purpose of this lab. But really you could do them here in the data analysis section or in both places. This technically is part of the data analysis section, so in my lab I reference it as being on the facing page of the data analysis, but there's really no need to do the calculations in one place or the other. You can do them, as long as they're shown, you can do them anywhere you want. I also added a legend on the right hand side of this graph to show you what all the points are for. It's not really necessary in this lab, but as we do more and more data collection as the semester goes on, we will need to have a legend because we may have several different lines or several different graphs on the same paper. At the top of this slide, I show my data collection table. This is the data that came from the actual graphed or traced tile pieces. I've summarized it in this one table so that I don't have to continually refer back to the actual tile pieces. The tile pieces are part of my data collection, as is this table, but I've copied them all on here, and I had a spot in my procedure where I talked about moving them to this spot. I put them in order of the tile numbers, 1, 2, 3, 4, and I listed them in area and mass so that I could plot them appropriately. Underneath the data table is the data analysis section. In my report, I referenced back to the graph that I just did on the facing page in my first sentence. I did that because most of my calculations are done on the graph instead of in this actual written part. There's no need to do that. I could have done my calculations here, but I just wanted to be clear where you could find the calculations. But again, the calculations could be done in this section as well. Underneath that black line, or in where that black line is, I've clipped out a large section of text where I describe the calculations, how I did them, and why. But the calculations that are shown on the facing page on the graph, if they're not self-explanatory, they should be explained as to why I did them. I repeated the final calculation of the mass of the full tile at the bottom of my data analysis section. It is done on the graph as well, but I repeated it here so that if anybody was just reading the data analysis section, they wouldn't have to go back and forth between the two sections. Again, this isn't necessary. It's only necessary to be shown once, as long as it's clear and the answer is in a clear place where it can be easily found. This is what my summary and error analysis looks like. I whited out a little bit of it because I didn't want you to just copy what I have. You should be coming up with this on your own. But let's take a look at the beginning of my summary. Like in an English class where you have to summarize a story, you begin with how the story begins, and you go through the entire plot of the story, and then when you come to the end of the story, you explain the ending of the story. You don't just start with the end. Likewise, in the tile lab, we're going to do the same thing by starting with the purpose of the lab. So I start with the purpose of this lab was to determine the mass of a full piece of floor tile using only small pieces of tile and the known size of a full piece. Then I go on and explain what I had, the 4 small pieces, and what I did with them. Of course, I went through and I measured their area, I measured their mass, I recorded it, I graphed it, and got the slope, and then calculated the final answer from the total slope, or from the slope and the total area. You should have all of this in your summary. The end of your summary should include, of course, the purpose of the lab and the answer. So you should have the mass of the full tile somewhere in your concluding sentence or two of your summary. After your summary, you need to include some error analysis. In my case, I included one possible source of error is that determining the area by counting the graph paper squares is not precise. This is because of the partly covered squares. Then I go on to tell about how I could improve that accuracy, and there are several ways of improving the accuracy. Of course, I could use smaller squares, or I could use more tile pieces. The more data you have, the more the errors tend to average out, and you get closer to the actual value. The approximation improves the more tile pieces you have. You should have at least 2 sources of error. Remember that sources of error don't mean that you've made mistakes in the lab. Sources of error are recognition by you that there are problems that could be overcome with a little bit better data or better measurements or other sorts of things. Remember that you need to have at least 2 sources of error in your summary or after your summary in order to have a complete lab report.